right, tonight on our Great American Panel, he is a member of the House Financial Services Committee. Michigan Congressman Thaddeus McCotter is here. He's the author of 7 books, including Black Hawk Down and his latest, The Best Game Ever. What do you think it is? And it's now available in paperback. Writer Mark Bowden is with us, and he has worked at the Washington Post, serving as an editorial writer, op-ed columnist, and a White House correspondent. Fox News contributor Juan is back with us. Guys, good to see you.
Good to see you, Sean.
All right, we've talked a lot about this nomination, and one of the cases we just highlighted was this case of New Haven firefighters. Here's a guy, Frank Ricci, 19 other firemen. They all take the same test. It ends up that they have 15 positions, 14 white candidates do better, 1 Hispanic candidate does better, and they're going to get the position. What do you think about it? Is that reverse discrimination?
Well, you got to look as a broader context, understand that in many cases when you look at firefighters, policemen around the country, these have been all white groups, that there has been systemic discrimination against people of color from joining these organizations. So what happens here is then the city says, you know what, we want to have a test. It's not a matter of your cousin's going to join and your cousin gets the union card, etc. We're going to have a test. They put a test in place, and that's when I think that it is subject to the kind of upset that you're talking about, where, you know, these guys, white or black, worked very hard, earned the scores, and they should be acknowledged. But let's just be clear, this is trying to undo a long history of blacks being excluded from this. If
racial discrimination is wrong, and everybody on this panel agrees that it's wrong, then, and how do we get to this point where we don't judge people by the content, by the color of the skin, but by the content of their character? You know, in this particular case, this guy studied for months and months and months. It was a race-neutral test.
Well, do you assume then that no people of color are capable of being good firefighters in New Haven, Connecticut?
No.
Well, that's what the test said. The test said it was only white people that were.
Come on. What I'm saying is that if everyone gets a fair shot at the test and everyone has a fair shot to study, and we shouldn't look at race at all in that case. We should look at who does better and discern. It's an objective discerning.
Well, in an ideal world, I think you'd be right, Sean, but I think there's a legitimate social interest in redressing what has been centuries of exclusion in not just a fire department, but in a police department or in a newspaper where I work. And yes, it does create instances of great unfairness.
Then you explain this to, look in the camera and you talk to Frank Ricci, who had the highest score on this particular exam. Why should he personally bear the burden of past wrongs and past injustices, which we all agree occurred, that he's not responsible for? Why should we institutionalize discrimination when we all find it morally repugnant?
Because the legislature, I presume, in that city decided that it was of more importance to the community.
I don't care about the legislature.
Well, you've been harping on the importance. You've been harping on the importance of judges not making policy. All right, here's an instance where the local legislature made a policy, and you would like a judge to basically overrule the...
No, not at all. I think there are certain equal protections under the law that goes for everybody that shouldn't be race-based. Congressman?
Well, clearly the question becomes, do you hold the sins of the father against the son? What we're trying to do is root out generations of invidious racism, but the problem becomes, in an effort to do the right thing, do you go too far? Do you then start to hold the same standards against other applicants that you did not want held against people in the first place? And I think that when you talk about the case before us, what you're really looking at is a case of, was there systemic, insidious racism throughout the contest? Was it inherent in the test? And the answer is no. And that is what we believe, many people, that the judge should have been circumscribed by in making their determination, rather than allowing her own judgment to take the place.
Well, what about this comment that we've been focusing on? There were a couple of them here, but here's the one that I would hope that a wise Latina woman with the richness of her experience would more often than not reach a better conclusion than a white male who hasn't lived that life. And then going on to say, I'll accept that some of her judging and decisions will be based on her gender and her Latina heritage. Should people be concerned that she is going to let race and gender influence her decision-making? Because that's what she's saying.
No, she's saying that's who she is. I mean, that's her life experience. That's what Senator Hatch just said to you. I mean, when you look at Chief Justice Roberts or Alito or Thomas, all these people bring their life experiences into play. There's no such thing as a totally objective judge.
But Senator Hatch went on to say that if these statements were made in reverse by somebody who was white...
This goes back to the firefighter case. If it was made by a white male who said, you know what, given America's history of how minorities have been treated and how, let's say, this Puerto Rican woman who grew up in the South Bronx housing project has been treated.
Her life story is compelling.
And so, absolutely. So if you're saying, somebody like that is not going to get in the game because historically in America she would never have been considered to sit on the high court.
Well, but the difference here is she's saying that she's going to make decisions. I accept that there will be decisions, a difference in my judging based on my gender and my race. That's what she's saying. So I'm just trying to think. The Constitution is the Constitution. It should be interpreted. Now, I disagree with her statement that the Court of Appeals is where policy is made. That's not the role of a judge.
Correct. That shouldn't be. But of course, it's human. She's a human being, Sean, and so she's going to be different. You could say that about Chief Justice Roberts, that he loves corporate America. He doesn't make a decision, and his parents all came out of corporate America, and therefore we shouldn't allow Chief Justice Roberts to do that.
Sean, if I can, I'm married to a wise Latina woman who routinely makes better decisions than her Irish husband in our house. But the fundamental point is, justice is blind, it isn't biased. You have to sometimes, perhaps you have to try even harder to be impartial. The danger that we're seeing by throwing the quality of empathy out, which really belongs in the purview of the legislative branch where you represent people and can be thrown out. When you start having judges talk about being empathetic, the average member of the public figures, well, everybody must like me, so if I run into a judge who's empathetic, they'll side with me. The reality is far different. You need a neutral arbiter of people who come to court, and the danger is in stressing empathy.
I'll give you the final word in this segment.
Well, actually what scares me more than a judge who brings her gender and her life experience into her decision-making are justices who operate out of a fixed ideological framework, or the idea that the Constitution should be interpreted exactly as it was written in the 18th century, which to me...
That's not what an originalist is. That is not what an originalist says at all. But it doesn't matter. We do have a legislative branch and we do have an executive branch. They do have roles, and a judge's role is not to do anything but interpret the law based on the Constitution, correct?
Yeah, I think
Isn't that their role?
I think interpret the law based on the Constitution.
So it's not to write policy. In other words, the Court of Appeals is where policy is made. It's not her role as a judge.
She's absolutely wrong to say that, and I thought it was ridiculous that the whole group there was snickering about it.
And mocking it.
Well, of course, that is wrong. But remember that what President Obama said was 95% of the time he wants someone who can interpret the Constitution, but 5% of the time he wants somebody who has some heart, some understanding for what human beings are going through in this country.
Well, I would think that every judge is a natural facet would bring that in, but they still got the Constitution, which is our bedrock.
Well, I'll tell you what, if she gets up in front of the Congress and says, I intend to try to make policy on the bench, then I think
she's going to hide it. That's the whole thing. Oh, I know I'm on tape. I shouldn't say it.
I think she'll get a pretty good.
She's not going to bring it.
I think she'll get a pretty good working over.
Sounds to me like she's going to try. She's going to go and say what she needs to say to get on the court. It's a lifetime appointment.
I think we're all going to learn a lot more about it.
You don't think they all do?
It's a good point. All right, I concede. They probably do. Time now to check in with Greta Van Susteren to get a sneak peek of what's coming up in 20 short minutes from right now when she goes on the record. Greta.
Good evening, Sean. And just into Fox, it has been reported that North Korea has just fired another missile. We're going to have the very latest on what's going on in North Korea. Jeff Scales is here to show exactly what's going on, as well as Ambassador John Bolton to talk about North Korea, which is no doubt about it is an increasing threat to the world. Plus, Ken Starr is here. He was a federal appeals court judge. We're going to ask him about the new appointment to the Supreme Court and how we get that appointment. What should be what should we look for? That and much more. Back to you.
All right, Greta. 19 minutes from right now, we'll talk about North Korea when we get back. Also, Pat Robertson will be here. More with our great American panel straight ahead. We continue now with our great American panel. All right, we got North Korea now has restarted its plant that extracts bomb-grade plutonium, the explosion, the missile testing.
Well, I think what the big news here is now that South Korea has had enough, and they're saying they're going to intercept ships that are bringing any kind of biological nuclear material to the North. Well, if that happens, the North is really going to declare war. So I think President Obama's got it on his plate. The question is, can he get cooperation from the Russians, from the Chinese, to put pressure?
Yeah, it's a very dangerous situation. It's why we didn't want Saddam Hussein to have nuclear weapons. Once a country has weapons like those and has the capability of delivering them, then the stakes are very, very dangerous, much higher.
You add to that Iran and Ahmadinejad, and I feel that the president is about as close to or even weaker than Jimmy Carter in terms of, I just don't feel there's any there just doesn't seem to be any force behind it. He's telling, you know, Benjamin Netanyahu that I expect that Iran within a year is going to respond to my proposals. I think that is so naive.
You might be right, actually.
Well, I think that what you saw is when the president talked about giving Iran an open hand, they gave him the middle finger with the ballistic missile tests, the putting of their Navy into international waters. You also see the nexus between North Korea and Iran. And so what the United States has to do in both those instances is look at Russia and look at communist China and see whether they are serious or not about helping to solve these problems, or whether they want to continue to use them.
Why do you think Iran will respond to Obama's outreach and negotiation?
Well, it's going to depend on what happens in the elections in June, which is just, you know, a few weeks away. Ahmadinejad is running for re-election, and he's playing to his home audience. I think he's made a number of gestures, favorable gestures, like releasing the journalist from prison, but by the same token he's made bellicose statements which play to his own electorate. So if he is unelected, which may well happen, you might see a dramatic shift in their approach.
Juan?
You know what, I think this is all about campaigning right now. He's campaigning, and in fact his opponents are all for dialogue with the United States. He's the only guy who's out there, but he's decided that's the way he's going to, you know, make or break it in this campaign. I just think he's a nut.
I agree, and a dangerous one.
He's sending a message to the Arab nations within the Gulf region as to what the United States' potential diminishment of influence looks like.
All right, guys, thanks for being with us. We have the results of our text vote poll, and we asked you to judge Supreme Court nominee Sonia Sotomayor. 8% of you thought she was fit to serve. 90% too radical. I agree with you. 2% says it doesn't matter. And by the way, thanks to all of you who voted. And when we come back, Pat Robertson, we're going to get his reaction to the California Supreme Court ruling on Proposition 8 and how do you navigate your family through these tough economic times. That we'll ask him about North Korea and Iran straight ahead.